Drink this, it'll warm you.
Thank you. They're coming for me, aren't they?
The snow was silent until Ethan Cole found a body at his fence. A stranger, half frozen, half dead, whispering words no rancher dared hear. Ethan gave him coffee, a choice so small, yet so dangerous, because by nightfall, 30 shadows rose from the timber, torches in their hands, fire along his fence. Was it a warning or a sentence? The storm had rolled in from the north without warning, a hard wall of white that buried the Montana plains and turned the sky into a gray lid clamped tight over the earth. Ethan Cole pulled his coat closer and leaned into the wind as he made his last check on the cattle. The snow stung like grit against his beard, and every breath turned to frost before it left his lips. It was the kind of weather that didn't forgive mistakes. A man caught out here unprepared was a man already dead. The fence line stretched like a skeleton across the drifted pasture, each post a dark finger clawing at the white. Ethan followed it with practiced eyes, making sure no section had snapped beneath the weight of snow or the pressure of restless stock. That was when he saw the shape. At first, he thought it was a calf down in the drift, legs kicking weakly, but calves didn't wear boots. And calves didn't leave a black smear of blood against the snow. Ethan squinted, heart tightening. A man lay half buried against the bottom wire, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him, the other clutching at nothing. The snow had already begun to cover him, smoothing the outline of his body like a grave filling itself in. Ethan reined his horse to a stop. He sat there for a long moment, letting the wind whip his coat, watching the still figure. Every instinct told him to ride on. A stranger on your land could be trouble. Sometimes they were drifters, sometimes deserters, sometimes worse. More than one rancher had been robbed, or worse, because he'd played the Good Samaritan. Out here, mercy could get you killed. He muttered the words his father used to say whenever a neighbor complained about beggars or strangers. A man freezing is every man's brother. Ethan cursed under his breath. That voice from the past always had a way of cutting through his excuses. He swung down from his saddle, boots sinking deep into the drift. The man was barely conscious, his lips cracked, his breath shallow and ragged. Ethan grabbed him under the arms and heaved. The body was light, too light for a grown man, all bone and sinew under a threadbare coat. Ethan half dragged, half carried him to the horse, slung him across the saddle, and led the way back toward the house. By the time they reached the ranch house, Ethan's arms burned and his back ached, but he didn't slow. He shoved the door open, carried the stranger inside, and kicked it shut against the wind. The sudden quiet was almost as jarring as the storm. The fire in the stone hearth glowed low, and Ethan lowered the man onto a rug beside it. For a moment, he just stared at him. The man's face was gaunt, the skin stretched too tight over his cheekbones, and his hair was long, matted with ice. Around his neck hung a strip of beadwork, colors dulled, but patterns still clear. A single feather was tied into it, black-tipped, and across his wrists, old scars, the kind left by bindings pulled too tight for too long. Ethan frowned. This wasn't just some cowhand down on his luck. He grabbed a kettle from the stove, poured hot coffee into a tin cup, and crouched beside the stranger. "Here, drink." The man's eyes opened slowly. They were dark, unreadable, and carried the kind of weight a man only got from seeing too much too soon. He stared at the cup as if it were a weapon, then shifted his gaze to Ethan. "It's coffee," Ethan said gruffly. "Hot. Won't kill you." The man's lips moved, forming words like he had to reach for them. "Coffee. Good." His accent was heavy, words broken, but he sipped cautiously when Ethan lifted the cup to his mouth. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the wind clawing at the shutters. Finally, Ethan asked, "Name?" The stranger hesitated, then said quietly, "Naiche." The syllables were careful, guarded, as though he wasn't sure he wanted to share them at all. Ethan gave a slow nod. "Ethan Cole, this is my place." Naiche looked around the cabin, the rough-hewn beams, the rifles mounted on the wall, the single iron bed, and then back at Ethan. His eyes lingered on the coffee cup, on the flames, and something softened in his expression. "You help," he said at last. "Why?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, staring into the fire. "Because my father would have skinned me alive if I left a man to freeze. That's why." Naichi gave a faint smile that wasn't really a smile at all, more a shadow of one. "Most not help." Ethan studied him again, noting the beadwork, the feather, the scars. He wasn't just a drifter, and the thought sat heavy in Ethan's gut. He'd brought a storm into his house tonight, and he knew it. By the next morning, the storm had broken. A pale sun shone across the valley, turning the snow into a blinding sheet of white. Ethan saddled his horse and rode into town for supplies, the stranger still weak but breathing steady by the fire when he left. He told himself he wouldn't mention it, that the man was just another nameless drifter passing through. But towns like theirs had long memories and sharp tongues, and word had already outrun him. At the general store, the air was thick with gossip. Men crowded near the stove, stomping snow from their boots, voices carrying louder than usual. Ethan had barely stepped inside before he felt the stares. "Cole," someone muttered, and a few heads turned. Old Henry, who ran the counter, cleared his throat. "Hear you had company last night?" Ethan set a sack of flour on the counter and answered evenly, "Found a man in the snow by my fence, half dead. I gave him coffee and a fire, that's all." A ranch hand spat into the sawdust near his boots. "1 coffee today, 30 rifles tomorrow. That's how it starts." The murmur of agreement spread through the room like dry grass catching flame. Sheriff Harlan pushed away from the wall where he'd been leaning. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of eyes that had seen too much. He raised a hand, and the room quieted a little. "Nobody's saying Cole broke the law. A man freezing's a man freezing, but we can't ignore the risk either." His voice was calm, measured. The voice of someone used to keeping balance on a knife's edge. Jeb Wilkins slammed his fist against the counter. "Risk? My herd was cut near in half last spring. Tracks led straight south toward Apache country. Don't tell me this drifter ain't scouting. They send one ahead, soft-spoken, half-dead, begging charity. Then the rest come riding behind. Same story every time." His face was red, his jaw working with bitterness that had been festering since long before Ethan found Naichi in the snow. Ethan kept his tone flat, though his pulse quickened. "The man I pulled out of the drift was closer to dying than scouting. He couldn't lift a rifle if you set it in his hands." "That's what they want you to think," Jeb snapped. "You'll see. Mark my words, you'll bring war down on this valley." From near the shelves of canned peaches, a quiet voice broke in. "Or maybe he'll bring something better." Every head turned. It was Clara Jennings, the schoolteacher. A widow in her 30s with dark hair tied in a neat bun, and eyes that didn't waver even when half the town glared at her. She set her basket of supplies on the counter. "Not everyone who comes from the hills is a spy. Sometimes a man is just cold and hungry. Seems to me Mr. Cole did what any decent Christian ought to." Jeb barked a laugh. "Easy for you to say, schoolmarm. You ain't got stock to lose or bloodkin buried from raids." Clara's chin lifted. "And you think hate will bring them back?" Her gaze swept the room, steady as a rifle barrel. "Fear makes cowards of honest men. Dignity means helping, even when it costs you." The silence that followed was sharp. Even Sheriff Harlan gave a slight nod, though he quickly turned it into a cough. Ethan gathered his supplies and paid Henry without another word. He didn't enjoy being defended, didn't like being the center of talk. But Clara's words sat with him as he rode out of town, heavier than the flour and beans in his saddlebag. By the time he reached his ranch, the sun was sinking low. The snow glittered in long shadows, and the world seemed too quiet. Ethan dismounted at the barn, pausing as a shape flickered against the ridge. A horseman, black against the fading sky. Then another, then two more. They lingered just long enough to be seen, then slipped back over the rise. Ethan's hand tightened on the reins. He told himself it was just neighbors checking fence lines, or riders bound for another spread. But the unease in his gut said otherwise. He glanced toward the house where Naichi waited by the fire and felt the cold settle deeper than the winter air. The storm outside had passed, but another was gathering, one that no amount of snow could bury. The fire burned low, filling the cabin with the scent of pine sap and smoke. Ethan sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, listening to the storm of silence between himself and the stranger he'd carried in. The man had said little since that first night, speaking only when thirst or pain forced him. But now, with color returning faintly to his face, his eyes followed Ethan with a weight that said words were coming, whether Ethan wanted them or not. Naichi shifted in the blanket draped over his shoulders. His movements were slow, careful, as if every bone in his body had been jarred loose and barely set back in place. He studied the steam rising from the cup Ethan had poured for him, then spoke in halting English, each word shaped like it had to be carved from stone. Snow, not enemy. Cold, not enemy. Men, enemy. Ethan raised his brow but didn't speak. He'd learned that silence often brought out more than questions. Naichi's gaze fell into the fire. Came down from hills. Small band, families, we move quiet, not for war, for winter meat. His voice caught and he pressed a hand against his ribs. But men wait. White men, guns. Ethan's gut tightened. He'd heard the stories. Posses calling themselves protectors, ranchers who'd rather empty their rifles than share the land. Naichi drew a line in the air with his finger, as if sketching ghosts. They fire. No talk. No chance. Women, children, all fall. His eyes hardened, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw flame behind them. But it wasn't rage. It was grief hammered flat into something colder. Some fight back? Ethan asked quietly. Naichi shook his head. No time. Not fight. Only run. I run. Bullet. He lifted his coat to reveal the torn cloth and dark bandage Ethan had wrapped earlier. Took me inside. I fall in snow. Long time. He gave a short, bitter laugh that carried no humor. Would die, but fence stopped me. Ethan leaned back, the weight of it pressing down on him. Half the county wanted to believe men like Naichi were born enemies, waiting with knives in the dark. Yet here he was, ribs broken, kin slaughtered, and still he hadn't raised a hand in vengeance, just a man who wanted to live long enough to see another fire. They drank in silence a while. The only sound, the pop of the logs. Then Naichi spoke again, softer this time, like he was speaking more to the flames than to Ethan. One hand, given in cold, worth more than 100, spring? Ethan turned the words over, letting them settle into the cracks of his mind. Out here, generosity was measured in inches, not miles. A neighbor might share grain in summer when the bins were full, but it cost nothing. Giving to a man on the edge of death, that cost something. It was trust laid bare. You don't owe me anything, Ethan said finally. His voice was rougher than he meant it to be. Naichi lifted his eyes. They were dark, but steady. No debt, only truth. You give life, life returns. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the weight of that gaze. He wasn't looking for promises or bonds. He'd just acted on an old memory of his father's voice, but in the way Naichi said it, the words sounded more like a covenant than a thank you. The cabin creaked in the wind. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, hiding tracks, smoothing over evidence of the world's cruelty. Ethan stared into his cup, thinking of the whispers in town. The suspicion in men's eyes, Jeb Wilkins pounding his fist on the counter. Half the valley wanted Naichi gone, and maybe if he had sense, Ethan would ride into town himself and turn him over, wash his hands of it before it ruined him. But when he looked back at the stranger by his fire, he didn't see a scout or a threat. He saw a man hollowed out by loss, stitched together by sheer will, carrying scars that spoke louder than any rumor. A man who had walked out of death's shadow and into his corral fence. Ethan poured more coffee and slid the cup closer. You'll heal here. he said simply. Naichi accepted, his scarred hands trembling as he took it. For the first time, his lips curved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make the room warmer than the fire. And in that moment, Ethan realized the fence he had to guard wasn't just the one around his pasture. It was the thin, fragile boundary between dignity and fear, between seeing a man as human or as enemy, and once you crossed it, there was no going back. 3 days later, the snow lay crusted and hard across the valley, glittering under a pale sun. Ethan had just finished chopping wood when he saw a rider on the ridge. Sheriff Harlan came down slow, his bay gelding puffing steam into the cold. Ethan set the axe in the block and waited. The sheriff dismounted without ceremony, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He looked older in daylight, the lines at his eyes carved deep as canyon walls. "Men are talking," Harlan said, pulling his gloves off one finger at a time. "And talk out here runs faster than sense." Ethan crossed his arms. "I figured as much." Harlan's gaze flicked toward the cabin. "They say you're harboring one of them, an Apache scout, maybe a Cheyenne runner. That true?" "I found a man freezing in the snow. That's the only truth that matters." The sheriff sighed, heavy as a man hauling 2 loads at once. "You know how this county thinks. Jeb Wilkins lost 20 head last spring. Folks like him don't need much to stoke a fire. He's telling anyone who'll listen that you're feeding outlaws, maybe planning a raid." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And you? What do you believe?" Harlan studied him a long moment. "I believe you've got more sense than to risk your spread for a stranger. But sense don't always matter when a crowd gets worked up." He put his gloves back on. "I came to warn you. Keep your rifle handy, Cole. You may need it." By sundown, the warning proved true. The sound of hooves came first, a half dozen, maybe more. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, Winchester resting against his shoulder. Jeb Wilkins led the group, his hat pulled low, his breath smoking like a furnace. Behind him rode 3 ranchers and 2 farmhands, all hard-faced, all carrying rifles. "Cole," Jeb barked. "Time to hand him over." Ethan's voice was steady. "Ain't handing over anybody. He's hurt. He's staying here till he can walk on his own." Jeb spat into the snow. "Walk on his own? You mean walk out with a war party at his back? You think we don't know how this works? 1 coffee today, 30 rifles tomorrow." Ethan's grip tightened on the Winchester. "And you'd hang a man for the crime of being cold? Then you're no better than the frost itself." A murmur ran through the group. Some eyes dropped, others hardened. Jeb leaned forward in his saddle, pointing his rifle toward the barn. "You got no right to put the rest of us at risk. You turn him over now, or we'll come take him." Ethan raised his weapon, not aiming, but holding it ready. "You cross that fence, Jeb, and you'll find out just how much right I've got." The standoff stretched taut as a wire fence in winter. Breath plumed, horses shifted, leather creaked. Then, sharp and sudden, a rifle cracked. The shot tore into the barn door, splintering wood. The horses screamed and stamped, men jerking their reins. Ethan swung his rifle up. "Next bullet finds flesh!" His voice cut like steel. But before another word could spark blood, the cabin door opened. Naichi stepped into the cold. One hand braced against the frame. His face was pale, but his eyes burned dark. He said something in his own tongue, low and steady. Then, in broken English, "No fight. Not here." Ethan half-turned, fury rising. "They'd see you hang, Naichi." Naichi's voice was calm, almost resigned. "If fights start, no end. Blood bring more blood. You know this." The words hung in the frozen air, heavier than any rifle. Even Jeb shifted uncomfortably, unsettled by the man's composure. The sheriff's warning echoed in Ethan's mind. He lowered his rifle a fraction, but didn't break his stance. "You've made your point, Jeb. Now take your men and ride out before this valley remembers what real violence looks like." Jeb glared at him, jaw working, but the others were already pulling at their reins, eager to be gone. With a final curse, he turned his horse and led them back into the twilight. Ethan lowered his rifle only when the last echo of hooves faded. He turned to Naichi, who leaned against the doorframe, breathing hard. "You should have stayed inside." Ethan muttered. Naichi's eyes met his, steady despite the pain. Storm coming, Ethan Cole, not from sky, from men. Ethan looked toward the ridge, where smoke from Jeb's pipe still lingered in the fading light, and knew he was right. The valley lay smothered in silence that night. Snow had fallen again, powdery and light, bearing hoof prints, softening the scars left on the barn by the bullet. Ethan sat at the table with his rifle laid across his knees, listening to every groan of timber and whisper of wind. Sleep would not come, not when men had ridden up his lane with murder in their eyes. Near midnight, Copper, his bay gelding, nickered low from the barn. Ethan rose, muscles coiled, and stepped to the door. The moon cast pale light across the yard, turning the snow into silver. Movement flickered at the edges. He brought the rifle to his shoulder, finger ready on the trigger. At first, he thought it was raiders. Jeb Wilkins had returned with more men, come to finish what they'd started. But what broke the tree line was nothing he'd expected. One figure, then another still, until the ridge spilled over with riders moving silent as shadows, mounted warriors wrapped in blankets, paint glinting faintly on their faces, feathers and beadwork catching the moon. Their horses padded forward with uncanny quiet, hooves muffled by snow. Ethan's heart hammered. He held his rifle steady, but did not fire. The lead warrior raised a hand. Behind him, the riders dismounted as one, each carrying a torch. Ethan braced for flame, his barn, his house, his fences reduced to ash. But instead, they walked to the posts lining his property, thrusting each torch into the snow-packed ground. One by one, fire bloomed along the fence line, not devouring, but illuminating. The flames licked upward, orange against the white drifts, until his entire spread glowed in a ring of light. Not a word was spoken. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the rifle lowered now, forgotten in his hand. The warriors moved with reverence, not menace. Their faces were grave, their silence deliberate. Inside, Naichi pushed the door open and staggered out, wrapped in the blanket Ethan had given him. He leaned heavily against the frame but raised his chin, eyes shining with recognition. He whispered something in his own tongue, soft, broken syllables that Ethan couldn't follow but felt in his bones. The lead warrior, tall with hair braided down his back and a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. He laid a hand on Naichi's shoulder, bowing his head. Then he looked to Ethan. For a long moment, their gazes locked. No words, no gestures beyond that steady regard. But in it, Ethan understood. Naichi was kin, blood to the man's son slain in that ambush. Ethan had given shelter when others would have left him to die, and now, in return, the whole band had come to bear witness. The firelight snapped in the stillness, reflecting off the snow like 1,000 watchful eyes. The meaning was plain. We saw what you did. You are under our protection now. From across the valley, lanterns flickered. The townsfolk had come out, drawn by the strange glow. They gathered on distant ridges, whispering among themselves, watching as the line of fire traced every inch of Ethan's spread. Some clutched their coats tight, muttering of omens. Others stood silent, struck dumb by the sight. Jeb Wilkins was among them, his face pale in the torchlight. He had no bluster now, no spit on his tongue. 30 warriors stood like sentinels around Ethan's ranch, their torches unyielding, their presence a shield stronger than any lawman's badge. Ethan lowered his rifle to the porch rail, his breath visible in the cold. Well, he muttered under his breath, I reckon that answers the question of whether you're alone, Naiche. Naichi's lips curved faintly, the ghost of a smile. His voice was low, raspy. Not alone. Never alone. Blood, remember. The torches burned long into the night, flames steady against the wind. Warriors stood at each post, unmoving, their silhouettes carved sharp against the snow. They did not speak, did not threaten. They simply watched, holding vigil for a man who had given coffee and fire to one of their own. By dawn, when the sun broke pink across the horizon, the warriors mounted in silence. They pulled their torches free, quenched them in the snow, and rode back into the hills without a word. The fence posts stood blackened but unburned. each one a marker of honor. Ethan stood in the yard, the cold biting through his coat, watching the last rider vanish. He had not asked for protection, had not sought it, but it had been given all the same, freely, as sure as he'd given that first cup of coffee. And as the townsfolk drifted away, no one dared call him traitor, not with the memory of 30 silent fires still burning in their eyes. By morning, the valley was humming. Smoke still lingered faintly over Ethan's land, a ghostly reminder of the torches that had burned there through the night. Word had already spread from homestead to homestead, carried on lantern light and wagging tongues. Some said Ethan Cole had struck a bargain with raiders, trading his soul for safety. Others whispered it was no bargain at all, that what they had witnessed was an honor few men would ever live to see. At the general store, voices rose and fell in heated currents. 30 of 'em, I heard, one farmer muttered, his hands buried in his coat pockets. Not a word spoken, just lit his fence and stood there till dawn. Sounds like a warning to me, another replied. You let one of their kind sleep under your roof, and next thing you know, they're laying claim to your spread. But then came a quieter voice from the back, a schoolteacher named Clara, her hands folded around a sack of flour. Or maybe they were saying thanks. You ever think of that? No bullets, no blood, just fire to light the dark. The words hung in the air longer than the arguments, longer than the mutters of traitor that slipped off bitter tongues. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Harlan rode out to the ranch. Ethan was mending the barn door where Jeb's bullet had splintered it. The sheriff dismounted slow, same as before, but his face carried something new. Not just weariness, but something close to respect. You may have just kept this valley from war, Harlan said, his voice low. Men don't come 30 strong without a reason. They came to show restraint, not revenge. That's rare. Ethan wiped the sawdust from his palms. Didn't feel rare when I was standing there with a rifle in my hand. The sheriff gave a thin smile. Most men in your boots would have pulled that trigger. But you didn't. And now we've got something better than law on our side. We've got understanding. Not everyone shared that view. Jeb Wilkins stood outside the saloon, red-eyed and spitting venom. He's invited the enemy in. Can't you fools see it? He'll bring 'em to our doors, one torch at a time. His voice cracked with fury, but the crowd didn't answer him. They shuffled, avoided his gaze, some turning their backs outright. For the first time in years, Jeb's fire failed to catch. He stood there, sputtering alone, the echo of his words falling flat against the clapboard walls. Back at the ranch, quiet settled heavy. The snow gleamed under the weak winter sun, and the fence posts still bore their blackened crowns, each one a sentinel of the night before. Inside, Naichi was lacing his moccasins, the blanket folded neatly on the chair. His color had returned, though the wound still slowed him. Ethan leaned in the doorway, watching. You don't have to rush off, Ethan said. Naichi looked up, his eyes steady. Storm pass, my path go on. He reached into his satchel and drew out a small piece of antler, carved smooth and marked with dark lines burned into its surface. Fire-etched, the symbols curved like rivers and flames. He pressed it into Ethan's palm. For you, Naichi said simply. Friend. Ethan turned the piece over in his hand, feeling the weight of it. It was no trinket. It was a bond, as strong as any oath spoken under God's sky. You sure you'll be all right? Ethan asked. Naichi gave the faintest smile. The kind born of pain survived. Snow is cold, but I walk warmer now. He pulled his coat tight, stepped out into the pale sun, and walked toward the ridge where the torches had burned. Ethan watched until the figure became part of the horizon, until the hills swallowed him whole. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch with the carved antler resting on the rail beside him. The valley stretched quiet, the snow gleaming, the fence posts blackened like monuments. He felt the loneliness of the ranch, sharp and familiar, but something in it had shifted. He wasn't just a solitary rancher anymore. He was part of a story larger than his fences, larger than the valley's suspicions. A story of fire in the snow, of dignity given when it cost something, of a bond that had crossed the lines men drew in fear. The wind stirred the pines, and Ethan curled his fingers around the antler token. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt alive. The days that followed slipped into memory. But the story of Ethan Cole's fence line spread farther than the valley. Some told it in saloons as a tale of warning. Never trust a drifter, never let fire touch your posts. Others told it softer, around kitchen tables, as proof that sometimes a single act of mercy can turn aside the sharp edge of war. But Ethan himself carried no interest in the rumors. He carried the antler token, smooth and warm in his palm, a reminder that what happened on that frozen night was not chance. It was choice, his choice. A man had come to his door half dead, and instead of closing it, he had opened it. That was all. And yet it was enough to bring 30 warriors out of the dark, enough to make even hardened ranchers question their certainty. Sheriff Harlan stopped by once more weeks later and said, "You may never know what you prevented, Cole, but I do. I've seen valleys bleed for less." Ethan only nodded. Some truths needed no answering. Jeb Wilkins grew quieter after that winter. He still cursed Ethan's name, still muttered about traitors, but his voice held less weight now. The men who once echoed him no longer did. They had seen what 30 silent torches meant, and the memory of it kept their rifles lowered. As for Naichi, he was never seen again in Dry Creek Valley. But every spring, when the snow melted, Ethan found small signs near the ridgeline. A feather caught in the fence, a stone carefully stacked on another, once even a set of moccasin prints that led to his water trough and vanished into the prairie. Each sign said the same thing as the antler in his hand. You are not forgotten. Ethan Cole remained what he had always been, a solitary rancher with more sky than company. But the loneliness had shifted. The silence no longer pressed on him like a burden. It carried weight, yes, but a weight that steadied rather than crushed. A weight that reminded him his fences had been lit not in threat, but in honor. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of the frontier. That kindness costs, but its return is never measured in coin. It is measured in bonds across fences, across languages, across griefs that no man should carry alone. What about you? If you'd been Ethan Cole, standing on that porch with the valley watching, would you have taken the risk of sheltering a stranger? Or shut your door to the cold? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next tale from the forgotten frontier. Share this story with a friend who loves Western history and quiet acts of courage. And check out the videos on your screen right now for more stories of legacies, redemption, and justice on the edge of the frontier. And remember, we post a new story here every single day. Until next time, ride steady.